just looking around us, especially during this time of the pandemic, there's been a growing distrust of authorities, of institutions, even the institution of science itself. What are the pros and cons of authorities, would you say? So, what's nice about authorities? What's nice about institutions? And what are their pitfalls?
One standard function of authority is as something you can defer to respectably without needing to seem too submissive or ignorant or gullible. That is, when you're asking what should I act on, or what belief should I act on, you might be worried if I chose something too contrarian, too weird, too speculative, that would make me look bad. So I would just choose something very conservative. Mm-hmm. So maybe an authority lets you choose something a little less conservative because the authority is your authorization. The authority will let you do it. And you can say, and somebody says, why did you do that thing? And they say, the authority authorized it. The authority tells me I should do this. Why aren't you doing it? Right?
So the authority is often pushing for the conservative.
Well, no, the authority can do more. I mean, so for example, we just think about, I don't know, in a pandemic even, right? You could just think, oh, I'll just stay home and close all the doors, or I'll just ignore it, right? You could just think of just some very simple strategy that might be defensible if there were no authorities, right? But authorities might be able to no more than that. They might be able to look at some evidence, draw a more context-dependent conclusion, declare it as the authority's opinion, and then other people might follow that. And that could be better than doing nothing.
So what you mentioned, WHO, the world's most beloved organization. So, this is me speaking in general. WHO and CDC has been kind of, depending on degrees and details, just not behaving as I would have imagined in the best possible evolution of human civilization authorities should act. They seem to have failed in some fundamental way in terms of leadership in a difficult time for our society. Can you say what are the pros and cons of this particular authority?
So again, if there were no authorities whatsoever, no accepted authorities, then people would have to randomly pick different local authorities who would conflict with each other, and then they'd be fighting each other about that, or just not believe anybody and just do some initial default action that you would always do without responding to context. So the potential gain of an authority is that they could no more than just basic ignorance. And if people followed them, they could both be more informed than ignorance and all doing the same thing. So they're each protected from being accused or complained about. That's the idea of an authority. That would be the good.
What's the con of that?
Okay.
What's the negative? How does that go wrong?
The con is that if you think of yourself as the authority and asking what's my best strategy as an authority, it's unfortunately not to be maximally informative. So you might think the ideal authority would not just tell you more than ignorance. It would tell you as much as possible. Okay. It would give you as much detail as you could possibly listen to and manage to assimilate. And it would update that as frequently as possible, or as frequently as you were able to listen and assimilate. And that would be the maximally informative authority. Mm-hmm. The problem is there's a conflict between being an authority or being seen as an authority and being maximally informative. That was the point of my blog post that you're pointing out to here. That is, if you look at it from their point of view, they won't long remain the perceived authority if they are too incautious about how they use that authority. And one of the ways to be incautious would be to be too informative.
Okay, that's still in the pro column for me, because you're talking about the tensions that are very data-driven and very honest, and I would hope that authorities struggle with that, how much information to provide to people to maximize outcomes. Now, I'm generally somebody that believes more information is better because I trust in the intelligence of people, but I'd like to mention a bigger con on authorities, which is the human question. This comes back to global government and so on, is that, there's humans that sit in chairs during meetings in those authorities. They have different titles. Humans form hierarchies. And sometimes those titles get to your head a little bit. And you start to want to think, how do I preserve my control over this authority? As opposed to thinking through, like, what is the mission of the authority? What is the mission of WHO and any other such organization? And how do I maximize the implementation of that mission? You start to think, well, I kind of like sitting in this big chair at the head of the table. I'd like to sit there for another few years. Or better yet, I want to be remembered as the person who, in a time of crisis, was at the head of this authority and did a lot of good things. So you stop trying to do good under what good means, given the mission of the authority, and you start to try to carve a narrative, to manipulate the narrative. First, in the meeting room, everybody around you, just a small little story you tell yourself. The new interns, the managers, throughout the whole hierarchy of the company. Okay, once everybody in the company or in the organization believes this narrative, now you start to control the release of information, not because you're trying to maximize outcomes, but because you're trying to maximize the effectiveness of the narrative that you are truly a great representative of this authority in human history. And I just feel like those human forces, whenever you have an authority, it starts getting to people's heads. One of the most, me as a scientist, one of the most disappointing things to see during the pandemic is the use of authority from colleagues of mine to roll their eyes, to dismiss other human beings just because they got a PhD, just because they're an assistant, associate, full faculty, just because they are deputy head of X organization, NIH, whatever the heck the organization is, just because they got an award of some kind. And at a conference, they won a best paper award 7 years ago, and then somebody shook their hand and gave them a medal. Maybe it was a president. And it's been 20, 30 years that people have been patting them on the back saying how special they are, especially when they're controlling money and getting sucked up from other scientists who really want the money in a self-deception kind of way. They don't actually really care about your performance. And all of that gets to your head. And no longer are you the authority that's trying to do good and lessen the suffering in the world. You become an authority that just wants to maximize, self-preserve yourself in a sitting on a throne of power.
So this is core to sort of what it is to be an economist. I'm a professor of economics.
There you go with the authority again.
No, so it's about saying.
Just joking. Yes.
We often have a situation where we see a world of behavior, and then we see ways in which particular behaviors are not sort of maximally socially useful.
Yes.
And we have a variety of reactions to that. So one kind of reaction is to sort of morally blame each individual for not doing the maximally socially useful thing, under perhaps the idea that people could be identified and shamed for that and maybe induced into doing the better thing if only enough people were calling them out on it, right? But another way to think about it is to think that people sit in institutions with certain stable institutional structures, and that institutions create particular incentives for individuals, and that individuals are typically doing whatever is in their local interest in the context of that institution. And then, perhaps to less blame individuals for winning their local institutional game and more blaming the world for having the wrong institutions. So economists are often like wondering what other institutions we could have instead of the ones we have and which of them might promote better behavior. And this is a common thing we do all across human behavior, is to think of what are the institutions we're in and what are the alternative variations we could imagine, and then to say which institutions would be most productive. I would agree with you that our information institutions, that is the institutions by which we collect information and aggregate it and share it with people, are especially broken in the sense of far from the ideal of what would be the most cost-effective way to collect and share information. But then the challenge is to try to produce better institutions. And, as an academic, I'm aware that academia is particularly broken in the sense that we give people incentives to, do research that's not very interesting or important, because basically they're being impressive. And we actually care more about whether academics are impressive than whether they're interesting or useful. And I can go happy to go into detail with lots of different known institutions and their known institutional failings, ways in which those institutions produce, incentives that are mistaken. And that was the point of the post we started with, talking about the authorities. If I need to be seen as an authority, that's at odds with my being informative, and I might choose to be the authority instead of being informative because that's my institutional incentives.
And if I may, I'd like to, given that beautiful picture of incentives and individuals that you just painted, let me just apologize for a couple of things. One, I often put too much blame on leaders of institutions versus the incentives that govern those institutions. And as a result of that, I believe, too critical of Anthony Fauci, too emotional about my criticism of Anthony Fauci. And I'd like to apologize for that, because I think there's deeper truths to think about. There's deeper incentives to think about. That said, I'm a romantic creature by nature. I romanticize Winston Churchill, and when I think about Nazi Germany, I think about Hitler more than I do about the individual people of Nazi Germany. You think about leaders, you think about individuals, not necessarily the parameters, the incentives that govern the system. Because it's harder. It's harder to think through deeply about the models from which those individuals arise. But that's the right thing to do. So, but also, I don't apologize for being emotional sometimes and being.
I'm happy to blame the individual leaders in the sense that, I might say, well, you should be trying to reform these institutions. If you're just there to get promoted and look good at being at the top, but maybe I can blame you for your motives and your priorities in there. But I can understand why the people at the top would be the people who are selected for having the priority of primarily trying to get to the top. I get that.
Can I maybe ask you about particularly universities? They've received, science has received an increase in distrust overall as an institution, which breaks my heart because I think science is beautiful as not as an institution, but as one of the journeys that humans have taken on. The other one is university. I think university is actually a place, for me at least, in the way I see it, is a place of freedom of exploring ideas, scientific ideas, engineering ideas, more than corporate, more than a company, more than a lot of domains in life. It's not just in its ideal, but it's in its implementation, a place where you can be a kid for your whole life and play with ideas. And I think with all the criticism that universities still not currently receive, I don't think that criticism is representative of universities. They focus on very anecdotal evidence of particular departments, particular people, but I still feel like there's a lot of place for freedom of thought. At least, MIT, at least in the fields I care about, in particular kind of science, particular kind of technical fields, mathematics, computer science, physics, engineering, so robotics, artificial intelligence. This is a place where you get to be a kid. Yet there is bureaucracy that's rising up. There's more rules, there's more meetings, and there's more administration having PowerPoint presentations, which to me, you should be more of a renegade explorer of ideas. And meetings they suffocate that radical thought that happens when you're an undergraduate student, and you can do all kinds of wild things when you're a graduate student. Anyway, all that to say, you've thought about this aspect too. Is there something positive, insightful you could say about how we can make for better universities in the decades to come? This particular institution, how can we improve them?
I hear that centuries ago, many scientists and intellectuals were aristocrats. They had time and could, if they choose to be intellectuals. that's a feature of the combination that they had some source of resources that allowed them leisure, and that the kind of competition they were faced in among aristocrats allowed that sort of a self-indulgence or self-pursuit, at least at some point in their lives. So the analogous observation is that university professors often have sort of the freedom and space to do a wide range of things. And I am certainly enjoying that as a tenured professor.
You're a really, sorry to interrupt, a really good representative of that. Just the exploration you're doing, the depth of thought, most people are afraid to do the kind of broad thinking that you're doing, which is great.
The fact that that can happen is the combination of these two things analogously. One is that we have fierce competition to become a tenured professor, but then once you become tenured, we give you the freedom to do what you like. And that's a happenstance. It didn't have to be that way. And in many other walks of life, even though people have a lot of, resources, et cetera, they don't have that kind of freedom set up. So I think I'm kind of lucky that tenure exists and that I'm enjoying it. But I can't be too enthusiastic about this unless I can approve of sort of the source of the resources that's paying for all this, right? So for the aristocrat, if you thought they stole it in war or something, you wouldn't be so pleased. Whereas if you thought they had earned it or their ancestors had earned this money that they were spending as an aristocrat, then you could be more okay with that, right? So for universities, I have to ask, where are the main sources of resources that are going to the universities, and are they getting their money's worth? Are they getting a good value for that payment, right? So first of all, there's students. And the question is, are students getting good value for their education? And, on each person is getting value in the sense that they are identified and shown to be a more capable person, which is then worth more salary as an employee later. But there is a case for saying there's a big waste to the system because we aren't actually changing the students or educating them. We're more sorting them or labeling them. And that's a very expensive process to produce that outcome. And part of the expense is the freedom from tenure I get. So I feel like I can't be too proud of that because it's basically a tax on all these young students to pay this enormous amount of money in order to be labeled as better, whereas I feel like we should be able to find cheaper ways of doing that. The other main customer is researcher patrons like the government or other foundations. And then the question is, are they getting their money worth out of the money they're paying for research to happen? And my analysis is they don't actually care about the research progress. They are mainly buying an affiliation with credentialed impressiveness on the part of the researchers. They mainly pay money to researchers who are impressive and have high, impressive affiliations, and they don't really much care what research project happens as a result.
Is that a cynical? So that there's a deep truth to that cynical perspective. Is there a less cynical perspective that they do care about the long-term investment into the progress of science and humanity?
Well, they might personally care, but they're stuck in an equilibrium.
Sure.
Wherein they basically most foundations like governments or research or, like the Ford Foundation, the individuals there are rated based on the prestige they bring to that organization.
Yeah.
And even if they might personally want to produce more intellectual progress, they are in a competitive game where they don't have tenure and they need to produce this prestige. And so once they give grant money to prestigious people, that is the thing that shows that they have achieved prestige for the organization. And that's what they need to do in order to retain their position.
And you do hope that there's a correlation between prestige and actual competence.
Of course, there is a correlation. The question is just, could we do this better some other way?
Yes.
And I think it's pretty clear we could. What is harder to do is move the world to a new equilibrium where we do that instead.
What are the components of the better ways to do it? Is it money? So how the sources of money and how the money is allocated to give the individual researchers freedom?
Years ago, I started studying this topic exactly because this was my issue, and this was many decades ago now, and I spent a long time, and my best guess still is prediction markets, betting markets. So if you as a research patron want to know the answer to a particular question, like what's the mass of the electron neutrino, then what you can do is just subsidize a betting market in that question And that will induce more research into answering that question, because the people who then answer that question can then make money in that betting market with the new information they gain. So that's a robust way to induce more information on a topic. If you want to induce an accomplishment, you can create prizes. And there's, of course, a long history of prizes to induce accomplishments. And we moved away from prizes, even though we once had used them far more often than we did today. And there's a history to that. And for the customers who want to be affiliated with impressive academics, which is what most of the customers want, students, journalists, and patrons, I think there's a better way of doing that, which I just wrote about in my second most recent blog post.
Can you explain?
Sure. What we do today is we take sort of acceptance by other academics recently as our best indication of their deserved prestige. That is, recent publications, recent job affiliation, institutional affiliations, recent invitations to speak, recent grants. We are today taking other impressive academics' recent choices to affiliate with them as our best guesstimate of their prestige. Mm-hmm. I would say we could do better by creating betting markets in what the distant future will judge to have been their deserved prestige, looking back on them. I think most intellectuals, for example, think that if we looked back 2 centuries, say, to intellectuals from 2 centuries ago, and tried to look in detail at their research and how it influenced future research and which path it was on, we could much more accurately judge their actual deserved prestige. That is, who was actually on the right track, who actually helped, which will be different than what people at the time judged using the immediate indications of the time, of which position they had or which publications they had or things like that. So
in this way, if you think from the perspective of multiple centuries, you would higher prioritize true novelty. You would disregard the temporal proximity, like how recent the thing is. And you would think, like, what is the brave, the bold, the big, novel idea that this, and you would actually,
you would be able to rate that because you could see the path with which ideas took, which things had dead ends, which led to what other followings. You could, looking back centuries later, have a much better estimate of who actually had what long-term effects on intellectual progress. So my proposal is we actually pay people in several centuries to do this historical analysis, and we have prediction markets today where we buy and sell assets, which will later pay off in terms of those final evaluations. And so now we'll be inducing people today to make their best estimate of those things by actually, looking at the details of people and setting the prices accordingly. So my proposal would be we rate people today on those prices today. So instead of looking at their list of publications or affiliations, you look at the actual price of assets that represent people's best guess of what the future will say about them.
It's brilliant. So this concept of idea futures, can you elaborate what this would entail?
I've been elaborating 2 versions of it here. So one is if there's a particular question, say the mass of the electron neutrino, and what you as a patron want to do is get an answer to that question, then what you would do is subsidize a betting market in that question under the assumption that eventually we'll just know the answer and we can pay off the bets that way, right? And that is a plausible assumption for many kinds of concrete intellectual questions like what's the mass of the electron neutrino.
In this hypothetical world that you're constructing that may be a real world, do you mean literally financial?
Yes,
like
literal,
market?
very literal, very cash. Very direct and literal, yes. So
or crypto.
Crypto is money.
Yes, true.
So the idea would be research labs would be for profit. They would have as their expense paying researchers to study things, and then their profit would come from using the insights the researchers gains to trade in these financial markets. Just like hedge funds today make money by paying researchers to study firms and then making their profits by trading on that insight in the ordinary financial market.
And the market would, if it's efficient, would be able to become better and better at predicting the powerful ideas that the individual is able to generate.
The variance around the mass of the electron neutrino would decrease with time as we learned that value of that parameter better and any other parameters that we wanted to estimate.
You don't think those markets would also respond to recency of prestige and all those kinds of things?
Well, they would respond, but the question is, if they might respond incorrectly, but if you think they're doing it incorrectly, you have a profit opportunity
there'll be a
where
correction mechanism.
you can go fix it. So we'd be inviting everybody to ask whether they can find any biases or errors in the current ways in which people are estimating these things from whatever clues they have.
Right. There's a big incentive for the correction mechanism. In academia currently, there's not it's the safe choice to go with the prestige.
Exactly.
And there's no,
even if you privately think that the prestige is overrated.
Even if you privately think strongly that it's overrated.
But still, you don't have an incentive to defy that publicly.
You're going to lose a lot unless you're a contrarian that writes brilliant blogs, and then you could talk about
perhaps.
it on a podcast.
Right. I mean, initially, this was my initial concept of having these betting markets on these key parameters. And what I then realized over time was that that's more what people pretend to care about. What they really mostly care about is just who's how good.
Yeah.
And that's what most of the system is built on, is trying to rate people and rank them. And so I designed this other alternative based on historical evaluation centuries later, just about who's how good, because that's what I think most of the customers really care about.
Customers. I like the word customers here. Humans.
Right. Well, every major area of life, which, has specialists who get paid to do that thing, must have some customers from elsewhere who are paying for it.
Well, who are the customers for the mass of the neutrino? But yes, I understand a sense, people who are willing to pay.
Right.
For a thing.
And that's an important thing to understand about anything. Who are the customers? So when I think of, and what's the product? Like medicine, education, academia, military, etc. That's part of the hidden motives analysis. Often people have a thing they say about what the product is and who the customer is, and maybe you need to dig a little deeper to find out what's really going on.